News of humanity victory at Kepler Station spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Species that had been hiding in fear suddenly found hope. The impossible had happened. The swarm had been defeated. But what shocked the galactic community even more was what humans did next. Instead of celebrating their defensive victory, they went on the attack. General Jung-ho commanded the human relief fleet heading toward the Nexus worlds, where 3 different alien civilizations were making their final stand against the swarm. The Nexari, the Vec, and the Crystal Collective had combined their remaining forces for one last desperate battle. They expected to die fighting, but they refused to surrender without trying. The human fleet arrived just as the Allied defenders were about to be overwhelmed. Hundreds of swarm bioships were closing in for the final attack. The organic vessels moved in perfect formation, their adaptation systems ready to counter any defense the Allies could mount. But General Jung-ho did something that made the alien commanders think he had lost his mind. Instead of reinforcing the defensive line or coordinating with the Allied forces, he split his fleet into 17 different groups and attacked from every direction at once. "Sir, our formations are completely exposed," his tactical officer Lieutenant Wu warned from the bridge of the flagship. "This violates every principle of fleet combat. The swarm will adapt to counter each attack vector and destroy us individually." "That is exactly what they think they are going to do," General Jung-ho replied calmly. "But they are trying to solve 17 different puzzles at the same time, and each puzzle changes every time they think they have found the answer." Each human ship group was fighting its own private war using completely different tactics and weapons. The first group, led by Captain Hyok, was using ramming attacks. Their ships would accelerate toward swarm vessels at maximum speed. Then, at the last second, the entire crew would evacuate to smaller escape pods. The unmanned ship would slam into the enemy vessel, while the crew escaped in random directions. The second group, commanded by Captain Sujin, was broadcasting music at frequencies that somehow disrupted swarm communication systems. The playlist included everything from classical symphonies to heavy metal rock songs to traditional folk music. The random audio signals confused the swarm collective intelligence, making coordination between their ships nearly impossible. Commander Jihoon Group was using their waste disposal systems as weapons. They had loaded their garbage processors with industrial chemicals, broken electronics, and organic waste, then fired the mixture at enemy ships like a disgusting form of artillery. The swarm bioships tried to analyze the chemical composition of the attacks, but there was no consistent pattern to study. Captain Nari had expanded her chaos tactics from single fighter operations to entire squadron maneuvers. Her pilots flew attack patterns based on completely random systems. Some followed mathematical sequences, others mimicked animal behavior patterns. One squadron was flying in formation based on the arrangement of stars in ancient Earth constellation. MAPS Lieutenant Sojin was still using her grandmother kimchi recipe as a tactical guide, but now she had taught the technique to other pilots. Her squadron attacked in waves that corresponded to the fermentation process of traditional Korean food. It made no military sense, but it worked because the swarm could not predict timing based on vegetable preservation methods. The most insane attack came from Commander Dong-Soo Group, who had weaponized their entertainment systems. They were firing holographic projectors at swarm ships, creating visual illusions that confused enemy sensors. The holograms showed fake human fleets attacking from directions where no ships actually existed. Major Sunho Squadron was using construction equipment as space combat weapons. They had modified industrial plasma cutters into beam weapons, asteroid mining charges into missiles, and even magnetic cargo handling systems into projectile launchers. Every piece of civilian technology had been turned into something that could fight. The swarm collective intelligence was experiencing something it had never encountered before: system overload. The organic ships were trying to adapt to 17 different types of attacks simultaneously, but each attack followed completely different rules. Some were high-technology energy weapons, others were basically rocks thrown really hard. Captain Yuban Group was firing their medical supplies as ammunition. They launched surgical equipment, pharmaceutical, drugs, and even hospital beds at enemy ships. The medical waste created chemical reactions when it hit swarm bioarmor, causing unpredictable damage that the alien adaptation systems could not counter. The most creative attack came from engineer Mayong, who had turned his ship food production systems into weapons. The agricultural processors were launching vegetables at high velocity, while the cooking systems fired superheated soup and coffee at enemy targets. It should not have worked. But somehow, the swarm ships were taking real damage from being hit by flying rice, and Kimchi Commander Taejin had weaponized his ship communication systems, broadcasting random radio signals at such high power that they overloaded swarm sensor equipment. The signals included everything from old Earth television shows to poetry readings to mathematical equations. None of it had any tactical value, but all of it was confusing. The enemy, as the battle continued, the swarm bioships began displaying more and more signs of confusion. Their perfect formations started to break apart. Individual ships began making independent decisions instead of following collective commands. Some swarm vessels actually started attacking each other by mistake. The Allied, alien forces watched in amazement as the human chaos tactics worked. The Nexari commander could not believe what he was seeing. Human ships were using construction tools, entertainment systems, medical equipment, and food preparation devices as weapons against the most advanced enemy in galactic history. How is this possible? The Crystal Collective representative asked through their communication crystals. Their tactics make no logical sense. They are violating every principle of space. Combat General Jung-ho heard the question and smiled. That is exactly the point, he replied. We are not trying to make logical sense. We are trying to win. The turning point came when the swarm collective intelligence made a critical error. It tried to adapt to all 17 human attack patterns at once. The bioships began changing their hull composition, weapon systems, and defensive capabilities so rapidly that they became unstable. Several swarm vessels actually tore themselves apart, trying to reconfigure their organic systems too quickly. Others became so confused by conflicting adaptation commands that they stopped fighting altogether and just drifted in space like lost animals. For the second time in galactic history, a swarm fleet began to retreat, but this time the retreat became a complete rout. The organic ships fled in panic, jumping to faster than light speed without any coordination. Some ships collided with each other in their rush to escape. Others jettisoned weapons and equipment to increase their speed. The Battle of Nexus Worlds was over. The combined human and alien forces had achieved a complete victory. The three allied civilizations were saved and hundreds of swarm bioships had been destroyed or forced to flee. But more importantly, the galaxy had learned something crucial about fighting the swarm. The key was not to use better weapons or stronger defenses. The key was to be so unpredictable that the enemy adaptation systems could not function. General Jung-ho received congratulations from commanders across the galaxy. But he knew this was just the beginning. The swarm was still out there, still destroying worlds, still consuming everything in their path. But now they knew that somewhere in the galaxy was a species that could fight back, and that species was just getting started. The swarm fleet arrived at Kepler Station expecting another easy victory. The massive organic ships moved through space like living creatures swimming through dark water. Their sensors detected the orbital mining facility around the planet Nu, Busan, exactly where their intelligence said it would be. The station appeared defenseless, with 50,000 human civilians who had made no attempt to evacuate. On the bridge of the largest swarm ship, the collective intelligence analyzed the situation. This was the species that had somehow survived the Vorthan attack. The humans had sent warning messages across the galaxy, but they seemed to be following the same pattern as every other species they had encountered. They were trying to protect. A fixed position with inferior technology station commander Jamin watched the approaching swarm fleet through the main observation window. The alien ships were beautiful in a terrifying way. They looked like they had been grown rather than built, with smooth curves and surfaces that shifted color in the light. Each ship was unique, but they moved together with perfect coordination. All stations, this is Control Commander Jamin announced over the communication system. Remember, we only get one chance to surprise them. Every person on this station volunteered to be here. Every person knows what we are fighting for. Make it count. The swarm attack began exactly as expected, their bioweapons charged with energy patterns that had destroyed hundreds of worlds. The first volley tore through the station outer hull, dissolving metal and composite materials at the molecular level. Sections of the mining facility vented atmosphere and debris into space. But instead of collapsing, the station began to change. Hidden mechanisms that had been built into the mining equipment started to activate. The mass drivers that normally launched containers of ore across space suddenly swiveled to point at the swarm ships. Engineer Yunha design was working perfectly. The first surprise came when the station started shooting back, but not with normal weapons. The mass drivers began launching projectiles that made no sense. Mining containers filled with scrap metal, chunks of asteroid rock, barrels of industrial waste, even pieces of broken machinery. Everything was fired at different velocities using different trajectories. The Swarm Collective tried to analyze the attack pattern so their ships could adapt and defend themselves, but there was no pattern to analyze. Each projectile was different. Each launch followed different physics. Some containers were spinning, others tumbling. Others had small rocket engines that changed their course randomly. Then Engineer Yunha activated the drilling systems. The massive lasers that normally cut through asteroid rock began firing at the swarm ships. But these were not normal laser weapons. Each drill had been modified to change its frequency and power level randomly. The beams shifted from infrared to ultraviolet to X-ray in patterns that followed no logical sequence. The swarm ships tried to adapt their hull materials to absorb or reflect the laser attacks. But as soon as their bio-armor changed to counter one frequency, the lasers switched to something completely different. It was like trying to design armor to stop a weapon that kept changing into different weapons. Deep inside the station, Chief Engineer Park activated the most insane part of their defense plan. The life support systems that normally maintained air pressure and temperature began operating as weapons. The atmospheric processors started creating pressure waves that disrupted swarm sensor equipment. The heating systems began generating electromagnetic pulses at random intervals. Commander Jamin authorized the use of the mining charges that had been hidden throughout the station. These were not military explosives. They were industrial blasting charges designed to break apart asteroids, but they had been wired with random delay timers so they would detonate at unpredictable times, creating debris fields that the swarm could not navigate safely. The battle became something that had never been seen before in galactic history. The swarm was fighting an enemy that used construction equipment as artillery waste disposal systems, as missile launchers and environmental controls, as electronic warfare devices. Nothing the humans used made any tactical sense, but somehow it was all working. Captain Nari led her fighter squadron in an attack that looked like organized insanity. Her pilots flew in formations based on the migration patterns of Earth birds, following paths that curved and spiraled without any military logic. Some fighters attacked alone, others in groups of random sizes. The only thing predictable about their tactics was that nothing was predictable. Lieutenant Sojin piloted her fighter following an attack pattern that her grandmother had taught her for making kimchi. The recipe called for specific timing and ingredient combinations that had nothing to do with space combat, but somehow translated into flight maneuvers that confused the swarm tracking systems. The Swarm Collective had never encountered anything like this. Their adaptation systems were designed to counter logical threats, but the humans were not being logical. They were being creative in ways that made no sense. Every time the swarm thought they understood the human attack pattern, the humans would do something completely different. Swarm bioships began displaying behavior that their collective intelligence had never experienced before. Confusion. The organic vessels started hesitating before making tactical decisions. Their formation flying became less precise. Their weapon targeting became less accurate. They were trying to solve a puzzle that changed every time they looked at it. Commander Jamin realized that their crazy plan was actually working. The swarm ships were powerful and adaptable, but they were also predictable in their unpredictability. They always responded to threats in the most efficient way possible. But efficiency required understanding the threat, and the swarm could not understand chaos. Give them more chaos, he ordered over the communication system. All stations fire everything we have. Use every weapon system, every piece of equipment, every random idea anyone can think of. The mining station began firing its waste processing systems like artillery. The water recycling pumps became high-pressure projectile weapons. The agricultural section started launching vegetables at enemy ships like organic ammunition. Even the communication arrays were modified to broadcast confusing signals that jammed. Swarm coordination for 18 hours, the battle continued. The station lost half its structure and thousands of civilians were evacuated to emergency shelters. But something impossible was happening. The swarm fleet that had destroyed entire civilizations was being held off by a mining station using construction equipment as weapons. Dr. Minho monitored the battle from a science station and realized they were witnessing galactic history. The Swarm Collective was making mistakes, real tactical errors, based on confusion and uncertainty. For the first time since they had begun their campaign of destruction, the Swarm was not winning easily. The end came suddenly. After 18 hours of chaotic combat, the Swarm ships began to withdraw. They did not retreat slowly or in good order. They fled like frightened animals, abandoning the battlefield and jumping to faster-than-light speed as quickly as their bioengines could power up. The defense of Kepler Station was over. 50,000 human civilians had held off a swarm fleet using mining equipment and pure stubbornness. Half the station was destroyed, but the other half was still operational. And most importantly, something that had never happened before in galactic history had just occurred. The first time ever a swarm fleet had been defeated. For the first time ever, the unstoppable enemy had stopped. Commander Jemin stood in the ruined control center, looking out at space where the swarm ships had been. The debris field around the station contained pieces of human mining equipment mixed with fragments of organic swarm technology. It was proof that the impossible had become possible. News of the victory spread across the galaxy faster than light communications could carry it. Species that had been preparing for extinction suddenly dared to hope again. The swarm could be beaten. It could be confused and defeated and forced to retreat. But the real shock was yet to come, because humanity was not finished fighting. They were just getting started. Deep under the city of Seoul, Dr. Sun-hee worked in the strangest laboratory ever built. The room was filled with pieces of destroyed swarm ships that had been collected from the Vorthan battle site. Next to the alien technology sat the most unusual collection of weapons that anyone had ever assembled. Dr. Sun-hee was humanity's best xenobiologist, but now she was working as a weapons designer. She had been studying the swarm technology for weeks, trying to understand how their adaptation systems worked. The other galactic species had tried to fight the swarm with bigger and better versions of normal weapons. They had all failed. The problem is that everyone thinks like engineers. She explained to her team of scientists and military officers. They see the swarm adapt to energy weapons, so they try different energy weapons. They see shields fail, so they try stronger shields, but adaptation requires patterns. Something to learn from. Colonel Daehan sat at the table listening carefully. He was one of humanity's best military strategists, but this situation was unlike anything he had studied in military school. The swarm was not just a powerful enemy. It was an enemy that became stronger every time you fought it, using normal methods. What do you mean by patterns? The colonel asked. Dr. Sun-hee picked up a piece of swarm technology that looked like living metal. The swarm learns by analyzing energy signatures, molecular structures, tactical formations. Everything has a pattern that can be studied and copied. But what if we attack with things that have no pattern? What if we use pure chaos as a weapon? She walked over to a wall covered with diagrams and equations. The mathematics looked insane. Random number generators, probability, theories, chaos equations. It was the kind of math that described storms and earthquakes, not military weapons. The swarm has never encountered a species like us. Dr. Sun-hee continued. Other civilizations fight with logic and reason. They use their best technology in the most efficient way possible, but humans are different. We can be completely unpredictable even to ourselves. She showed them video footage from the Vorthan battle. The swarm ships moved in perfect formations. Their weapons fired in precise patterns. Their adaptation happened in logical stages, first analyzing, then adjusting, then implementing. Everything the swarm did made perfect sense from a tactical perspective. But watch what happened when our ship got involved. "Doctor, son," he said. The video showed Captain Hyun's ship, the Serenity Edge, attacking the swarm in a way that made no tactical sense. The human ship flew in crazy loops, fired weapons at random intervals, and used mining equipment as artillery. The swarm tried to adapt to our attack pattern, but there was no pattern to adapt to. We were not following any military doctrine. We were just doing whatever seemed like it might work. And somehow it did work. Colonel Dahan studied the video footage carefully. The human ship should have been destroyed in minutes. Instead, it had lasted long enough to collect valuable intelligence and escape. The swarm ships had actually seemed confused by the random human tactics. "So our strategy is to be unpredictable," he said. "But how do we coordinate unpredictable attacks? How do we plan for chaos? That is the beauty of it." "Dr. Sun," he replied, "we do not coordinate. We do not plan. Each ship, each weapon, each soldier will fight their own way. The only rule is that there are no rules across human space." The most unusual military preparation in galactic history was taking place. Every human world was building defenses that violated basic military principles. Instead of putting their best weapons in the most protected locations, they were hiding them in random places. On the colony world of New Busan, engineer Yunha was converting mining equipment into weapons. The mass drivers that launched ore containers across space were being modified to fire projectiles at enemy ships. The drilling lasers that cut through rock were being turned into chaotic beam weapons that changed frequency every few seconds. "This makes no sense from an engineering perspective," engineer Yunha admitted to her team. "But the swarm expects things to make sense. Our advantage is that we can build things that should not work, but somehow do." The civilian population was not evacuating like other species would do. Instead, they were volunteering for combat roles. Farmers were learning to operate anti-spacecraft weapons. Factory workers were training as fighter pilots. Even children were being taught how to help with the defense effort. Commander Yamin was in charge of defending Kepler Station, the main orbital facility around New Busan. His defense plan looked like it had been designed by someone who was completely insane. The station had weapons pointing in every direction, including some that pointed at the station itself. "Are you sure this will work?" his tactical officer asked nervously. "Some of these weapon placements could destroy our own station if we use them wrong." "That is the point," Commander Jamin replied. "The swarm expects us to protect our own assets. They will try to use our defensive positions against us. But what if our defensive positions are also offensive weapons? What if we are willing to damage ourselves to hurt them?" Meanwhile, Captain Nari was training fighter pilots using combat maneuvers that had never been taught in any military academy. Her squadrons practiced flying in formations based on animal migration patterns, weather systems, and even musical compositions. Traditional fighter tactics assume the enemy will respond logically to your movements. Captain Nari explained to her pilots, "But we are going to move in ways that have no logical response. We will attack like a thunderstorm, chaotic and impossible to predict." The pilots practiced maneuvers that made them feel sick. Spiral patterns that followed no mathematical formula. Attack runs that changed direction based on random number generators. Defensive formations that looked like abstract art rather than military tactics. Dr. Minho had been assigned to study swarm psychology, even though the swarm did not seem to have individual personalities. The creatures appeared to be part of a collective intelligence that made decisions based on pure logic and efficiency. They do not understand concepts like honor or revenge or stubbornness. Dr. Minho reported to the Defense Planning Committee. "The swarm fights to achieve objectives in the most efficient way possible. They do not fight for emotional reasons." General Dongwu smiled when he heard this report. "Then we have found their weakness. Humans fight for emotional reasons all the time. We fight when it makes no sense to fight. We keep fighting when we should surrender. We fight harder when we are losing." The human military was preparing for a type of warfare that no species had ever attempted before. Instead of trying to outthink the enemy, they were planning to confuse the enemy. Instead of using their best tactics, they were planning to use their worst tactics in creative ways. Across the galaxy, other species were still debating evacuation plans. The great civilizations were pulling back from swarm territory, abandoning entire star systems to save their core worlds. They were fighting a strategic retreat that they hoped would buy them time to find a solution, but humanity was doing the opposite. Human colonies were moving closer to swarm territory. Volunteer fleets were heading toward the danger instead of away from it. Construction crews were building forward bases in systems that other species had abandoned. The Galactic Council received reports of human activity with confusion and alarm. Ambassador Taiwan had to explain to increasingly worried alien representatives that humanity was not committing suicide. They were preparing for war in their own unique way. We do not retreat from impossible fights. Ambassador Taiwan explained to the Council. We make impossible fights possible by changing the rules of the game. The swarm has learned how to defeat logical opponents, but we are not logical opponents as the swarm continued its advance toward human. Space-consuming world after world, the galaxy watched to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an unpredictable species. The answer would change galactic history forever. The great meeting hall of the Galactic Council had never been so full of fear. Ambassador Taiwan sat quietly in the corner, watching dozens of different alien species panic like scared children. The huge room was designed to hold representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy, but today it felt too small for all the terror. The holographic display in the center showed a map of the galaxy, with red zones marking where the swarm had attacked. System after system glowed red like infected wounds spreading across the star map. Every few hours another system would turn red as the swarm destroyed everything living there. Taiwan was the human ambassador to the Galactic Council. Earth had only learned about other intelligent species 6 months ago. Now humanity was sitting in the most important political meeting in galactic history. The other aliens were arguing about what to do, but all their ideas were about running away. The Christech representative was a being made of living crystal that sparkled when it talked. We must evacuate the core worlds, it said with a voice like breaking glass. The rim territories can be abandoned. We can hide in the outer galaxy until the swarm passes. A creature that looked like a giant insect clicked its mandibles in disagreement. The Nexari delegate waved its forearms as it spoke. The outer rim cannot support our populations. We would die slowly instead of dying quickly. Neither choice is acceptable. Ambassador Vextar was the leader of the Galactic Council. It was an ancient being that looked like a tree made of silver metal. Its voice was deep and rumbling like distant thunder. We have faced threats before, but never anything like this. The swarm cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bargained with. They simply consume everything. Taiwan listened to them argue for 2 hours. Every suggestion was about hiding or running away or surrendering. Some representatives wanted to scatter their people across thousands of different planets. Others wanted to build hiding places in asteroid fields or empty space between galaxies. Finally, Taiwan stood up and cleared his throat. The sound was small in the huge chamber, but somehow every alien stopped talking and looked at him. Perhaps he said in a calm voice, "You should ask what we learned from our encounter." The chamber became completely silent. Hundreds of alien eyes stared at the human representative. Most of these species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Humanity was so new that many aliens still thought of humans as primitive children. Supreme Chancellor Vextar focused its attention on Taiwan. Your ship observed the attack on the Vorthan station. What tactical information do you possess that might help us? Taiwan smiled, but it was not a happy smile. We did not just observe the attack, he said quietly. We fought back. The reaction was immediate. Shocked gasps and clicks and whistles filled the chamber. Several alien representatives stood up so quickly, they knocked over their chairs. The idea that someone had actually fought the swarm and survived was almost impossible to believe. The serpentine delegate was a creature that looked like a giant snake with arms. It reared up and hissed. Impossible. The swarm cannot be harmed by any weapon. They adapt to every attack within minutes. The Vorthans had the best military technology in the galaxy, and they were destroyed in less than an hour. Taiwan nodded his head slowly. That is correct, the Vorthans fought with conventional weapons and conventional tactics. The swarm learned how to counter everything they did. But we did not use conventional tactics. Another alien representative, a creature covered in fur and with 6 legs, spoke up in a voice, like barking dogs. The Croton Empire had the largest space fleet in the galaxy. They were warriors born for battle. The swarm destroyed their entire civilization in 3 days. What could your tiny species possibly do that the Crotons could not? That is because Taewon replied, "You think conventionally, we do not back on Earth." Admiral Youngsu was already preparing humanity response. Every military base on every human world was working day and night. Spaceships were being taken apart and rebuilt, with new weapons that made no sense to traditional military thinking. The human colonies were not evacuating like other species would do. Instead, they were moving closer to the threat. Volunteers were signing up for the most dangerous jobs in human history. They were building defenses that violated every rule of military engineering. Dr. Borum was working in a secret laboratory under the city of New Seoul. She was humanity's best expert on alien technology, but now she was working on something completely different. She was designing weapons based on chaos theory and random mathematics. The swarm learns from patterns, she explained to a group of military officers. They study how weapons work. Then they change their bodies to become immune. But what if we make weapons that have no patterns? What if we attack with pure randomness? Colonel Dahan listened carefully to her explanation. Traditional military thinking said you should use your best weapons and most effective tactics. But humanity was planning to do the opposite. They were going to use weapons that should not work and tactics that made no sense. We are going to confuse them. Dr. Borum continued. The swarm expects logical responses to logical problems, but humans are not always logical. We can be crazy and unpredictable. We can do things that make no sense but somehow work anyway. Meanwhile, civilian scientists were studying the swarm data that Captain Hyun had transmitted. They were not trying to build bigger weapons or stronger shields. Instead, they were looking for weaknesses that other species had missed. The swarm was incredibly advanced, but it had one problem. It was too logical. It followed patterns and rules. Even when it adapted to new threats, it did so in predictable ways. It was like a computer that could learn but could not imagine. Humans were different. Human minds could make connections that had no logical basis. Humans could see solutions that made no sense to rational thinking. Humans could be creative in ways that confused even other humans. Back at the Galactic Council, Ambassador Taewon was preparing to leave. The other aliens were still arguing about evacuation plans and surrender negotiations. They could not understand that there might be another way before he left. Taewon stood up one more time to address the council. We will share our tactical data with any species that wants to fight back, but understand that fighting the swarm requires thinking differently. It requires being willing to try impossible things. Supreme Chancellor Vextar spoke with its deep, rumbling voice. What are you planning? Human Taewon smiled again, and this time it was a dangerous smile. We are planning to show the swarm that some species do not know how to give up. We are going to teach them that logic is not always enough to win as. The human ambassador left the council chamber. The other aliens continued to argue about evacuation plans. But deep in space, the swarm was moving toward human territory. The unstoppable force that had destroyed dozens of civilizations was about to meet something it had never encountered before. It was about to meet humanity. Commander Jiwon stood at the big window of her spaceship watching something terrible happen far away in space. The alien space station was breaking apart and burning. The metal twisted like it was in pain and air leaked out into the empty darkness of space. Bodies of the friendly aliens floated away from their home that was now destroyed. The space station belonged to creatures called Vorthons. They looked like tall, thin people, but their skin was blue, and they had 4 arms. The Vorthons had been the first aliens that humans ever met in space. They were smart and kind. They wanted to be friends with humans. They shared their science and showed humans how to travel between stars faster. But now the Vorthon station was gone. Something had attacked it with weapons that humans had never seen before. The attack ships looked strange. They were not made of metal like human ships. Instead, they looked like they were grown like plants or animals. The ships had smooth curves and they moved. In space, like living things swimming through water, Jiwan had been visiting the Vorthan station with her crew to learn more about alien science. Her ship was called the Serenity Edge, and it was one of the newest human exploration ships they had come to the Vorthan system 3 days ago. Everything had been peaceful. The Vorthans were excited to show humans their new discoveries. Dr. Minho was working at his computer trying to understand what had happened. Minho was a scientist who studied alien life. He had spent many months learning the Vorthan language. He could talk to them and understand their culture. He was one of the few humans who really understood how aliens thought. The attack had happened very fast. The strange, organic-looking ships appeared from nowhere. They did not try to talk or ask for surrender. They just started destroying everything. The Vorthan defense ships tried to fight back, but their weapons did not work. The alien attackers seemed to absorb the energy from Vorthan weapons and become stronger. Minho was reading the last messages that the Vorthans sent before they died. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. The messages were full of fear and desperation. The Vorthans were trying to warn someone about something terrible. They keep calling it the swarm, Minho said to Jiwon. The Vorthans say this is not the first attack. The swarm has been destroying planets and space stations for over a year. They have killed entire civilizations. Jiwon felt cold inside her stomach. The Vorthans were a strong military people. They had weapons and shields that were better than anything humans had built. If the Vorthans could not fight off this swarm, then what chance did humanity have? How many worlds have they destroyed? Jiwon asked. Minho looked at his screen again, reading more of the Vorthan data. The numbers made him sick. According to this information, the swarm has attacked 47 different star systems. Every single one was completely destroyed. No survivors anywhere. Captain Hyun was listening to their conversation from her command chair. She was the leader of the mission, and she had to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to run away as fast as possible, get back to Earth and warn everyone. But something inside her said that running away was not enough. The Vorthans sent out a detailed report about the swarm before they died. Minho continued reading. They learned some things about how the swarm fights. The swarm ships are alive. Somehow they can change and adapt. Their weapons learn how to defeat any defense. The more you fight them, the stronger they become. This was the worst possible news. Jiwon realized that traditional military tactics would not work against an enemy that could adapt to any weapon humanity would need to find a completely different way to fight. Captain Hyun made a decision that would change everything. She stood up from her chair and walked to the communication station. Against all the rules and against orders from Earth Command, she decided to send an emergency signal to every human colony and back to Earth. "What are you doing?" Captain Jiwon asked. Hyun looked at her crew with determination in her eyes. "If we are going to face this enemy, then everyone needs to know what is coming. The whole galaxy needs to be warned." She activated the emergency beacon system. This was only supposed to be used if Earth itself was under direct attack. But Hyun believed the situation was even worse than that. The signal would reach Earth in 3 days, but it would also reach other alien civilizations who might be listening. The message contained all the data they had collected about the swarm attack. It included technical information about the swarm ships and weapons. It included the Vorthan research about how the swarm fought and won. It also included something else, a simple message that Hyun wrote herself. "We are humanity." She wrote in the message, "We are not alone in the universe, and we are all in danger. Something called the swarm is destroying entire worlds. We survived an attack and we have information. The galaxy needs to work together or we will all die." The signal burst out from their ship at faster than light speed. It would reach Earth first, then spread to other star systems. The Galactic Council would receive it within 5 days. Every major alien civilization would know that a new species called humanity had encountered the swarm and lived to tell about it. What they did not know was what humanity would do next. The other alien species had tried to fight the swarm with logic and traditional military thinking. They had failed because they followed the rules of normal warfare. But humans were different. Humans did not always follow rules. Humans could be unpredictable and crazy. Humans could think of solutions that made no sense to logical minds. Sometimes the craziest ideas worked better than the smart ones. Jiwan looked out at the destroyed Vorthan station and made a promise. The swarm thought it could destroy civilizations without any consequences, but now they had attacked friends of humanity. Now it was personal. The Serenity Edge turned away from the destruction and headed back toward human space. They carried with them the most important information in galactic history, the location and behavior patterns of the unstoppable enemy that was destroying everything. But they also carried something else that no other species possessed. They carried human stubbornness, human creativity, human refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. The war was coming. Whether the galaxy was ready or not, the swarm would continue spreading and destroying. But for the first time, the swarm was going to encounter something it had never faced before. It was going to encounter humanity, and humanity had never learned how to give up. 6 months after the first distress signal, Ambassador Taewon stood before the Galactic Council again. But this time, the atmosphere was very different. The swarm threat had been contained, pushed back into the dark spaces between galaxies by a species the galaxy was only beginning to understand. "We owe you a debt that cannot be repaid," Chancellor Vexitar admitted. "Your species saved us all. How can we thank you?" Taewon smiled the same diplomatic smile he'd worn throughout the crisis. "You can remember that sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem is to try something impossible back." The galaxy had learned something profound about humanity during the war. They weren't just another species with better weapons or superior tactics. They were fundamentally different in how they thought, how they fought, and how they refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. Dr. Minho, now head of the New Xenological Research Institute, was studying the long-term implications of humanity's emergence on the galactic stage. Other species followed logic, tradition, and proven methods. Humans followed hunches, took insane risks, and somehow made things work through sheer determination and creative insanity. "We've changed the galaxy just by being ourselves," he observed to his research team. "Every species now has to account for the human factor in their calculations. We've introduced chaos into a universe that ran on predictable patterns. The swarm still existed somewhere in the void between galaxies, but they would never again assume that conquest was inevitable. They had encountered something they couldn't adapt to, a species too crazy to follow their own rules, too stubborn to accept defeat, and too creative to be predicted. Across human space, colonies were expanding at an unprecedented rate, not away from danger but toward it. Humanity had found its place in the galaxy as the species that would fight the impossible battles, attempt the insane solutions, and somehow make it work. The distress signal that had once announced humanity's discovery of galactic civilization had become something else entirely. A warning to any threat that dared to challenge the galaxy. They now knew that somewhere among the stars was a species that would respond to any challenge with something no one had ever tried before, and somehow make it work. The galaxy was no longer the same. It was protected by chaos, defended by madness, and safeguarded by a species that didn't know the meaning of impossible. And that perhaps was exactly what the universe needed.